Hi, my name is Alicia Albrechtsen, and I am the DIYer behind Pneumatic Addict. On my website and social media channels, I typically share simple DIY ideas as well as some free building plans. Today, I'm partnering up with my friends from SawStop to show you how I made this bookshelf bench. If you're curious to see how I did it, keep watching.
The great thing about building furniture yourself is the fact that you can customize it to your exact needs and taste. My particular bookshelf bench is 60 inches wide, 16 inches deep, and sits about 20 inches tall. The whole unit is basically a divided box connected to a separate tapered leg base. I kinda have a love affair with poplar, so I chose to make my bookshelf out of solid wood poplar boards that I had in my shop. If you don't have a secret stash of 1.5 inch thick hardwood, don't worry, this project could easily be built with other off-the-shelf materials. For example, laminating or gluing together 2 sheets of 3/4 inch thick plywood is a great way to get an 1.5 inch thick substrate that's dead flat, easy to work with, and fairly inexpensive. If you don't want to worry about the layered edges of plywood, another option is to use dimensional or framing lumber from the hardware store. It may take a bit more effort to make it look beautiful, but if you take the time to plane your lumber and rip cut the rounded edges of the boards, you can easily glue several thinner boards together to create one larger panel. The poplar boards that I chose to use were still rough sawn, which means my first step was to take a bit of time to plane them down to my desired thickness of 1.5 inches, as well as jointing one edge so they were ready to glue together. The boards that I was using weren't wide enough for my design, so I connected pairs together using wood glue. You may choose to use some kind of reinforcement like dowels or biscuits, but I've found for panels this size, a properly glued together long grain seam is more than strong enough. I used clamps to hold my boards together, and while the glue dried, I started to work on the base assembly. For my bookshelf base, I chose to use more 1.5 inch thick poplar, but this would be a great place to switch up the materials if you wanted to try a different style. For example, I think a base made out of a different species of wood or stained a different color would look fantastic. If you really like that mid-century look and you want to save some time, another option would be to use prefabricated metal legs.
I want my stretchers to be perfectly square when you're looking down from the end, same length on all 4 sides. So a quick little trick to do that is I'm going to use the width that my boards are already planed down to as a little bit of a guide between the fence. So I'm going to set the board down, I'm going to loosen my fence and then slide it over so that my board is sandwiched between my blade and my fence. I don't want it too tight, I don't want it where it's pinching, but just enough where I can still slide the board, and then I lock my fence in place.
On the table saw, I began rip cutting my material into 1.5 inch square stock that I could use for my stretchers. I then grabbed a few wider boards which I could turn into feet.
I decided to get a little bit fancy and do some angle tapered legs for this project. That means I'm going to be making friends with my miter gauge so I can make very precise angle crosscuts.
In addition to cutting angles, a miter gauge is extremely helpful for making crosscuts, which are cuts made along the short side of your material, typically perpendicular to the grain. The gauge slides along T-shaped tracks integrated into the table on either side of the blade. You can adjust the gauge so it's easy to cut your material at a variety of angles. Once I cut the 4 legs into rough blocks, it was time to tackle the taper. I used a pencil and a ruler to mark the 2-sided tapered shape onto each block. I then created a shortcut tapering jig. I grabbed a scrap board which I knew was straight with 2 parallel sides. I then aligned the tapered angle of the block on one of the sides of the board. I then secured the 2 together using 1.5 inch long brad nails. I was very careful on where I placed my brad nails, making sure to keep them far away from the edge of the block or the board, so there was no chance with them coming into contact with the table saw blade. Since all 4 leg blocks needed to be cut at the same angle, I was able to line them up on the jig, one behind another, so that I could cut one side of each block at the same time. At this point, I could pry the leg blocks off the tapering jig. The brad nails left a few small holes, which could easily be filled later. I used the miter gauge to make my last few angled cuts to the bottom of the feet, and then they were shaped and ready to go. bookshelf base design that I drew up required that the shorter front-to-back stretchers be cut with a 10-degree bevel running lengthwise. I know that sounds really complicated, but it was actually a simple cut to make. At the table saw, I adjusted the angle of my blade to 10 degrees off square. I then adjusted my fence to the same 1.5 inch width and ripped down a short board, giving me the properly beveled stretcher. I chose to connect my stretchers to the legs using dowel joinery. I laid out my components in a dry fit arrangement so I could mark for the dowel locations. I then used a doweling jig and a cordless drill to make my 1 inch deep, 1/2 inch diameter holes. I then began to connect the base, starting with the short sides of the assembly. I connected pairs of legs together using the short beveled stretchers. I then was able to connect the longer stretchers together using the single center stretcher, and finally connecting the 2 shorter leg assemblies. Don't worry if you're not catching all the dimensions right now. SawStop and I have worked together to provide free building plans for this project, including a materials list and cutting diagrams. Waiting for glue to dry overnight is kind of like being a kid on Christmas Eve, except you're not always sure you're going to like what you're going to get.
We got the base assembly glued up last night and it should be good and dry by now, so that means it's time to remove the clamps.
Luckily, the base to my bookshelf bench sat nice and flat and all the joints were still tight. It was time to move on to the upper box portion of the unit.
Okay, now I got my boards glued together, creating extra wide panels, which I can then cut into specific components for the bench. I also made sure to straight line one of the edges, which will give me a nice true straight line that I can run up against the fence of the table saw as I get ready to cut the rest of the pieces of the bench. My next step is to go back over to the table saw to rip these down to their final width of 16 inches, which is the depth of the bench.
I set the fence of my table saw to 16 inches and then began to rip cut all of my panels.
All the panels are now ripped down to their final width, and both long sides are parallel to one another. So now it's time to turn everything around and cross cut the other direction.
With all my panels cut to the proper width and length, I could begin to cut the joinery. I chose to use relatively simple half-depth rabbets and dados to connect my pieces. They're not the most complex types of joints to make, but they provide a lot more gluing surface and will be a lot stronger than your average butt joint. Since I was using 1.5 inch thick material, to create the rabbets, I needed to remove an 1.5 inch wide by 3/4 inch long section of wood from the end of some of the panels. There's many different ways to achieve this kind of cut, especially if you have access to a dado stack blade. If you don't want to use a dado stack, you can still make the same kind of rabbet cuts using a single blade. For each of the joints, I used my miter gauge to make sure that I was cutting a perfectly perpendicular shoulder along the inside edge of the rabbet. Once the boundary of the joint was cleanly cut, I could start making several incremental cuts in the board, slowly hogging out the joint about 1/8 inch at a time. Once I reached the end of the board and the bulk of the material was removed, it was easy to remove the small slivers of remaining wood and then clean up the faces using a chisel. I cut 1.5 inch wide dados into the top and bottom panels in a similar way to the rabbets. Whether it's a half lap, groove, dado, rabbet, I've noticed whenever I'm making a joint using multiple passes on the table saw, it's best to sneak up on my spacing. To make sure I get a nice tight joint, I typically remove slightly less material than I think I'm going to need and always test my pieces using a dry fit. I can always take a little bit more out of the joint if it's too tight, but it's really difficult to put material back on if it's loose. Once all the dado joints were cut, I cleaned them up using a chisel and a light sanding. The last piece of joinery prep work was to drill a few more holes to accept some dowels. There's one spot in my design where the horizontal seat of the bench meets the vertical portion of the bookshelf. I could have used a groove to connect the pieces together, but I decided it would look better if it was a cleaner seam. Once I drilled the holes in the end of the horizontal seat, I plugged the holes using dowel centers and then flipped the panel, aligning it perpendicularly on the coordinating bookshelf side. The spikes of the dowel centers made very small indentations into the board, so I knew exactly where to drill so that my dowels would align.
All the components are sized and all the rabbets and dados are cut, so that means it's time for assembly. Once you start spreading glue on wood, you gotta move really, really fast. So I recruited an extra pair of hands. My husband's gonna help me out and we are going to try to get everything put together and clamped all at once.
The first thing we did was to tackle our dowel joint. We connected the horizontal seat to the vertical divider and set it aside. When gluing up larger pieces of furniture like this, I definitely recommend grabbing someone to help if you can. If that's not an option, you can always break the assembly down into smaller steps, connecting maybe 2 or 3 components at a time. If you are going to cannonball through the glue-up process like we did, you're going to want multiple clamps and a few damp rags laying around. We then began to assemble the box portion of the unit, beginning with the bottom panel and then adding our vertical dividers. Once they were all glued and moved into place, we moved in the doweled together seat assembly. We finally moved the top panel into place and made sure we applied even clamping pressure from all directions. We checked to make sure that each joint was tight and used damp rags to wipe off any glue squeeze out. The next morning, I took the bookshelf bench out of clamps and it was time to make her pretty. I gave every surface a good sanding, including the base assembly, starting with a 120 grit sanding disc and working my way up to a 220. I took both the base and the bookshelf bench outside and used a lint-free rag to remove any sawdust or sanding residue. It was finally time to apply the finish. Unlike a lot of DIYers, applying a finish to my project is usually my favorite step. I picked up several tips and tricks along the way, which I like to share in my build videos. For example, I chose to use a clear satin lacquer on this piece as opposed to a water-based finish because although both products dry very quickly, water-based products will cause fiber swelling and raise the grain of a bare wood. Another nice feature about most lacquer is the fact that you don't have to sand in between coats either. Whatever product you choose to finish your projects with, just make sure that you always follow manufacturer instructions. After our fourth and final coat of lacquer was dry, we moved the pieces inside the house and took them upstairs to their future home in our kids' playroom. At this point, I was ready to finally connect the base assembly to the box portion of the bookshelf bench. My husband helped me flip the box topside down onto the carpet. The first thing I did was to mark the locations and to pre-drill into the top inner edge of the base stretchers so they could accommodate figure-8 fasteners. I moved the base assembly in place, aligning it on the bottom panel. I then pre-drilled through the figure-8 fasteners and into the bottom of the bottom panel. Finally, I connected the two assemblies together using 1 1/4 inch panhead screws.
I'm going to quickly go over the process of creating an easy DIY upholstered cushion. But if you're interested in making one yourself, I highly recommend you head over to the Pneumatic Attic channel, my YouTube channel, where I just posted a step-by-step video going over the entire process of creating the cushion start to finish. I'm going to create an upholstered cushion that actually has a solid, hard base to it. You're not going to feel it when you sit down on it. It's just going to give the cushion some support. This is the same technique you would use if you wanted to create an upholstered cushion for maybe a bench or even a dining chair.
If the idea of creating your own upholstered seat cushion seems intimidating, don't worry. The technique that I used requires absolutely no sewing. And if you're still not interested in trying, I found lots of pre-upholstered seat cushion options online and in local home decor stores. The first thing to do was to take my particle board panel over to the table saw to cut it down to size. I cut a piece that was 16 3/4 inches wide and 15 3/4 inches deep, which is slightly smaller than the dimensions of my foam cushion.
I am using a pre-cut piece of 15 by 17 by 2 inch thick foam that I got from my local craft store and a piece of leftover shelving material. It's just particle board, but that's good, that'll work. And to cover it all, I am using some faux leather that I also got from my local craft store.
The upholstery process is pretty simple. I cut a piece of the faux leather and laid it face down onto my work surface. I then added a layer of quilt batting. I placed the foam cushion in the middle of the fabric and then topped it with my particle board panel. Then it was a matter of pulling the fabric and batting layers up around tightly and using an electric stapler to secure them to the bottom of the particle board. I created a simple corner pleat in each corner and trimmed off the excess material. The last step was to move the cushion into place. A really nice benefit of using a material like leather or faux leather is the fact that it creates a slight grip onto a smooth surface without using something like fasteners or adhesives. Although the idea of combining a bookshelf and a bench is kind of unorthodox, I'm really happy with how this piece turned out. It offers lots of much needed storage while looking stylish and being flexible enough to work in many rooms in the house. Make sure you grab your own set of free building plans so you can make your own bookshelf bench. Bookshelf.